First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude and thanks to Dr. Mahendra Gaur. Um, I think I have known him for the last 1 decade since since the time I was uh, just about finishing my PhD at the American Studies program at GNU. I was working at Observer Research Foundation, and since then I have followed his journal, which has done a very significant service and contribution to the students of the country and to scholars also who look forward to a very diverse. Anytime you pick up the journal, you will find diverse perspectives from all around the world, from both practitioners and scholars. And I think that is the significance of the journal that he produces. So I thank him very wholeheartedly for giving me this opportunity to talk on a subject, first of all, which is very close to my research and also teaching interests. I have followed this particular relationship, which is between India and the United States, and I still continue to follow as a student of American foreign policy and politics. And let me, let's say, just give some pointers in about this particular relationship in the next 30 minutes or so, and then let's make it more interactive. I will invite questions from the students, and I'll try my best to answer to the best of my ability. So let me just start by saying that it is a very important time to assess and analyze and study this particular bilateral relationship, which is between India and the United States. Why? Because as we are talking, India's Defense Minister, Rajnath Singh, and Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, they are both in Washington, D.C. For what is called as the 2+2 dialogue, the dialogue between the foreign and the defense ministries of the two countries. Now, it is also important because there has been a virtual meeting between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Joe Biden as sort of a sped work and a beginning to the 2+2 dialogue between the two countries. And it also comes at a very important time to discuss this particular relationship because this particular relationship has been in the news in recent times, not only because of the kind of relationship that has been going on between these two countries, which broadly you can say has had a positive arc of some sorts in this many years. But in recent times, in the last 1 month or so, because of the Ukraine crisis, because of the military sort of clash that has been happening in Ukraine, and also because of the diverging sort of approaches that you can see between how the US approaches the Ukraine crisis and how India approaches the Ukraine crisis. There has been a lot of scrutiny. There has been a lot of question marks which have been raised on this particular relationship. This is not to say that this particular relationship is in any kind of it is not in the ICU. It is not gone through any kind of particular, let's say, significant problem of some sorts. But nevertheless, this is an important juncture in which we can think of where this relationship is going ahead. To talk of this, I think it is very important to also understand why in the since the beginning of this new millennium, I would put the time frame at the final years of the Clinton administration, whereby in March 2000 there was a very significant visit from President Bill Clinton at a time when his term was coming to an end. That really opened up different dimensions of this relationship, which was again, improved and which was again endorsed during the 8 years of the Republican administration during George W. Bush. Now, that period is quite important. And I'm talking about all of this because I wanted to give some background, to start discussing about what is happening now in the Biden presidency and what perhaps is going to happen in the years to come. In this 8 years of George W. Bush administration, from 2000 to about 2008, a lot of interesting or important things happened. The most important of which was the signing of the India-US civil nuclear agreement, finally in 2008. Before that, there were discussions and movement ahead in terms of the next steps in strategic partnership between the two countries. So you can see that a very solid background, a solid bedrock was laid during the George W. Bush administration. There were some hesitations when the Democratic presidency of Barack Obama came forward. Hesitations in terms of whether the US-India relationship that had got a solid sort of bedrock during the George W. Bush administration, was that going to go in the same direction, for instance, during the Obama administration? So some of these hesitations were there, but nevertheless, we saw that very quickly the Obama administration also understood the importance of India as a rising power and the importance of the economic weight of India, the importance of India as a security guarantor, as a security provider, for example, in the larger Indian Ocean. And that's why when the Barack Obama administration started talking about an Asia rebalancing strategy in around 2011 or so, India's relationship with US, or particularly India's defense relationship with US, was seen to be what was called as the linchpin of Asia rebalancing strategy. Although the very idea of India being a linchpin of America's Asia rebalancing strategy got a bit of a lukewarm response from New Delhi. But nevertheless, the relationship went ahead in multifaceted dimensions even during the Obama administration. Manmohan Singh was the first leader who was invited for a state dinner in the Obama administration. Later on, when the relationship moved ahead, much of this relationship was based on the defense partnership between the two countries. Defense partnership, which you can see in terms of the sale and purchase of equipment between the US and India, although lesser than what we get from Russia. In the last, since it started in around 2007 to till now, there has been a substantial growth in the defense partnership in terms of buying and selling between the two countries. There continues to be a lot of talks about co-production and all those sort of things. But more importantly, there has been a lot of growth in military exercises between the two countries. You have multilateral exercises like the Malabar exercise. Apart from that, you have land army exercises between the two countries called Youth Abhyas, and a number of other exercises, including training together in the Jungle Warfare School of India in Vairangte in Mizoram. You have the COP year exercises between the air forces. And of course, the Malabar exercises is between the navies of the 4 Quad countries now. It's Australia, Japan, India, and the United States. So you see that there has been a lot of growth in the defense partnership between the two countries. Doesn't mean that there are no challenges in all of this. The high point of this relationship also came when, Prime Minister Narendra Modi was elected the Prime Minister of India. Again, there were some hesitations of where this relationship was going to go. But again, with his visit to the US, I think in 2014, which was turned out to be a very, very successful diplomatic event. And then in 2005, in a major diplomatic event, Barack Obama was invited and he accepted being the chief guest of the Indian Republic Day celebrations. And this was for the first time that any US president had ever come as chief guest of India's Republic Day celebrations. So, on the same time when Obama came, this was the second time when Obama was visiting India. He had visited earlier in 2010 also. In 2015, when he came, India and US also signed an agreement, a joint strategic vision of Asia Pacific and the Indian Ocean region, some kind of a harbinger, some kind of a curtain raiser to the India-US partnership in the Indo-Pacific that was going to really, I think, take a turn during the next administration, which was during the Trump administration. So again, sorry. Again, during the Trump administration, when Trump was elected in a very, very, let's say, nobody expected Trump to win the presidential elections in 2016. But when he finally got elected as the president of the United States, there again were very number of hesitations about his personality and his presidential style and whether there was going to be continuity in India-US relationship again. But proving a lot of skeptics wrong, at least in India-US partnership, at least in the Indo-Pacific partnership, the word called Indo-Pacific began to be adopted and accepted frontally, for example, during the Trump administration, which was made clear in many of his strategic documents. And it became the fulcrum of India-US relationship in some sense. So the hesitation that was there when President Trump became the US president was, I think, led to rest for many who were watching this relationship. And we largely saw a continuity, a larger continuity in the strategic rationale, the strategic reason why India and US was coming together, and which is the factor of China's rise in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, it goes without saying that China's economic and military rise in the Indo-Pacific region has been a concern for the United States, and we have had a complicated relationship with China, having an unresolved boundary dispute. So the aggression on China's part, also the Sino-Pakistan alliance, which has been quite detrimental to India's interests. So seeing all of this, you see that there is a convergence in the interests between India and the US, which is to manage the strategic ramifications of China's rise in the Indo-Pacific. So you see that the strategic rationale that brought India and US together in the first place was intact. It didn't go anywhere, right? So in a way, in international relation terms, we see that geopolitical considerations or geopolitics as a factor was bringing these two countries together, these two democracies together. Now, it is my understanding, or it is my assessment, my opinion that democratic values do not really play a very important part, although it's a force enabler in the relationship between India and US. It is rather the changing geopolitics. It is rather threat alignment of threat perceptions, whether threat perceptions of both India and US are aligned, whether China is a threat for US as it is a threat for India. If the threat perceptions are aligned, there comes a strategic rationale, there comes a strategic reason as to why certain countries come together. And I think that it is the geopolitical churning, or it's the geopolitics of China's rise, which has really brought these two countries together, and where they find some kind of a rationale of doing things together, especially, for example, in the military domain, as well as in many other non-military affairs as well. As you can see, that one of the groupings that really blossomed or came forward after having died some kind of an unnatural death, which is that in 2007, quadrilateral security dialogue was being talked about, but it was in 2017 during the Trump administration that quadrilateral security dialogue, also called the Quad, really came back. And this time there was sort of a strategic, continuity or strategic congruence among the four powers that were making up Quad, in order to think about how to re-engineer the security architecture of Indo-Pacific to the to the purpose of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. So I think the strategic rationality or the larger geopolitical understanding is very important in terms of really sort of trying to analyze and assess as to where this relationship is really going and why, despite the change of presidencies, despite the change of prime ministers in India, you see a larger continuity in this relationship. This relationship has not really gone through very, very significant challenges, despite the change of parties and leaders on both the sides. So the bedrock of this has really been, what you call as also the bipartisan support for India-US relationship in the US, in the sense that the nowadays we don't think too much, or we don't have sleepless nights over who is going to be the next president or from which party, because there is a larger belief or there is a larger understanding that whoever becomes the president from whichever party, there is a larger support for India in the US Congress in among both the parties, crossing both the parties. So there is some sense of a bipartisan support when it comes to India and US relationship. Likewise, the India-US relationship has grown ahead in India also, in the presence of both the BJP-led NDA as well as the Congress-led UPA. So there is also a larger sort of a political consensus when it comes to the importance of India-US relationship. Now, Trump, despite being very unpopular in America or unpopular in Europe, unpopular in many parts of the world because of his presidential style and other things, the argument is that at least for India-US relationship, he was able to maintain some kind of a continuity. There wasn't very drastic change when it came to India-US relationship. So you could see that even in the Trump administration, even in the disruptive 4 years of the Trump administration, you found a larger continuity in this relationship. Now, when it was very natural that when the Biden administration sort of came to the picture, when Joe Biden won the elections in 2020, again, as far as America is concerned, there were a lot of problems in terms of the election, the acceptance of the election results. Just before Biden was formally inaugurated, you had the January 6th insurrections at the US Capitol building. So you had a lot of internal turmoils inside the US when Biden became the US president. But the larger continuity that was there in the India-US relationship was sort of continued even in the Biden administration. Now, the Biden administration itself has taken ahead many of the things that were there during the previous administrations, whether it is the defense partnership between the two countries. Most of it has been continued. I forgot to mention that during the Trump administration, the signing of the foundational agreements were completed in the form of CONCASA and the logistic support agreement, as well as the agreement on geospatial understanding, which is called BECA. So all of these foundational agreements were completed during the Trump administration, were signed, which is meant to allow greater sharing of interoperability technologies between the two countries whenever we are doing this interoperability military exercises and other things. So all of this has sort of like been brought towards the Biden administration, has continued through the Biden administration. There are a lot of things that needs to be done on the economic part of the relationship. The vision that we have, that was there from right from the time of the Obama administration to touch like $500 billion of turnover between the two countries, and the greater understanding on bilateral investment treaty and all those things. Even during the Trump administration, the removal from the general preferential agreement, and also when it came to Trump's own obsession with reciprocity and tariff balance and trade balance between the two countries, this has caused a little bit of rupture, for example, in the economic understanding between the two countries. But apart from that, the larger strategic sort of development between the two countries has been largely positive until now. So Biden administration, when it came and occupied the administration in the White House, one or two things were waiting to happen. Of course, one was the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is a very important subject, which raised a lot of questions about the nature in which America withdrew from Afghanistan and the swift nature in which Taliban took over Kabul in a very, in a very dramatic fashion. And till now, this question hangs in the balance about Taliban recognition and how the Taliban government in Kabul is going to engage with the rest of the world. So when the Biden administration came, the Afghan question was hanging, like a short, in the sense that they had to take a decision, and he took a decision of withdrawal, which got criticized in many quarters, not because America was withdrawing. Everyone knew that US was going to withdraw from Afghanistan at some point or the other, but because of the way in which it withdrew, which allowed, for example, the Taliban to take power in such a short period of time. And the way in which the Afghan government, the Afghan military, which had been built in the last 20 years, just crumbled so swiftly. That raised a lot of challenges in terms of how India was now going to see its interest in Afghanistan now that the Taliban had come to power. Whether what kind of America's talking to the Taliban in Qatar, what kind of results that they're going to fetch, or what was the future of US going to be in Afghanistan, and what kind of diplomacy the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese and the Pakistanis were going to play in regarding Afghanistan, and where does that all leave India and leave India-US partnership? That that remains a question, because even as we were grappling with the withdrawal and the fallout of Afghanistan, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Ukraine crisis, which again has a very, very complicated Cold War history behind it, in a geography which is very far from us, in a geopolitics which is very far from us, where we do not have much of an influence of influencing that geopolitics. So given all these factors into consideration, India has been taking a stance, which again has not gone down very well with the West, in the sense that they have a very, very strict stance to very, very harsh stance towards what Russia has done, given the number of resolutions that have been passed at the UNGA or the UNSC or the UN Human Rights Council, even very recently, and India has abstained in all of them. So I think India has its own reasons for the way it has approached the Ukraine crisis, but which does not really align with how the United States and how the West sees. That's why in many speeches, in many writings, you would often find Western countries, especially in Western Europe and also the United States, calling India's response as disappointing or shaky, or all those kind of words have been used. The US Deputy NSA, Dalip Singh, had visited India very recently and had used words like consequences and all those things, again, which did not really feature very well, or was not accepted very well, for example, in New Delhi. So even as we were dealing with the fallout of the crisis in Afghanistan and the withdrawal in Afghanistan, and trying to sort of find ways of working around it, the Ukraine crisis came and raised a number of question marks over the nature of this relationship, whether this relationship has really matured in the way we thought it had, or there are still loopholes that we need to work in this relationship, or there are threat perceptions are not yet aligned in the sense that Russia is a threat for America, it's not for us in a sense, right? Um, Iran remains a very important threat or very significant threat for America, not so much for us. So there are a couple of things where our threat perceptions may not align. And the Ukraine crisis, I think, has really brought out that, let's say, fault line or a fissure in India-US relationship. Having said this, I do not think that this is necessarily really going to negatively impact uh, the movement of this relationship through the Quad and through the bilateral way in the Indo-Pacific, because both India and US understands that China is a threat, or China is a issue to handle with in the Indo-Pacific, and the US also understands that India's partnership and India's contribution as a major power in Asia is very substantial, inevitable, if it has to really think about facing the strategic ramifications of aggressive China and China's rise. Now, this again leaves a lot of question marks about India's diplomacy, leaves a lot of question marks about what are the issue areas or challenges that we need to work on for this particular relationship, which is India and the United States, to really move in a positive direction. But my last argument is that we are complicated democracies where decision making and processes of decision making are not that simple. Democracies take time, to shift directions in any way, and one of the ways of seeing that India and US is engaging is to see that we have opportunities, we have progress in our relationship, but we also have differences, we also have challenges. And that is the nature of any engagement. The only way not to have differences is not to engage at all, right? So I think the more multifaceted our engagement becomes, we are going to also face problems like the ones we are facing because of the Ukraine crisis, which is to align how we see threats in the international system, or should it be aligned at all? Is it necessary that if US sees Russia as a threat, India should also see Russia as a threat? If that is not necessary, how are we going to structure our relationship by keeping the focus on managing China in the Indo-Pacific? While Europe and America deals with their Russia problem in their own way, and we also sort of like find a way of engaging with Russia, of course, with some limitations. There will be limitations of any of those engagements. At the end, I want to argue that any foreign policy partnership or choices that you make, the choice of going ahead with US is going to have a cost on other partnerships. And that is the problem we are dealing with right now. That once we make a choice of going ahead with the United States, what is the cost that we are going to pay in our partnership with Russia? What is the cost that we are going to pay in our relationship with Iran and many other relationships like that? So I think I'll end here. I'll put an end here, and then probably it'll be much more fruitful if we had question and answers, questions from the students, and then I could respond back to them. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Monish. You have covered the ground very well. And he said actually important aspect of bilateral relations between India and US. And now I think the time when I expect that you will come out with this question. So please introduce yourself and put your question. And Dr. Monish will try to answer your query. Come on. Be quick. Yes, come on. I think there is, I should say that,
Good evening, sir.
yeah, go on.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. My name is Akriti Verma. So I would like to ask a question on CATSA, the Countering America's Adversary Through Sanctions Act. Could you please throw some light upon it?
Okay. Thank you. It's a very important question, and I would, Akriti, I would say it's, you know, although we know the near future, we know the immediate sort of what is, because we have got a waiver to some extent, we have got a exception. But in my own interactions with many American diplomats and scholars, they have often expressed this idea that this way, do not, I mean, to India, of course, that do not take this exception or waiver as something which is going to be there for always. So that is, I think, a major issue point. To begin, just to sort of like expand it a little bit, we all know that CATSA, Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, largely targets those countries which are dealing in, military hardware and other things with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So this was always a sticking point in the beginning itself. But I think you can say that India's importance, for example, to the whole Indo-Pacific strategy of the US is something that allowed India to, play around this limitation, in the sense that before India and Russia agreed on the delivery of S-400, right, which is actually the target for the CATSA. The whole drama is around this India's acquisition of S-400 Triumph missile defense systems from Russia, which I think is important from India's point of view to have such a weapon system. In the absence of alternatives, whether it is indigenously produced or whether it is given by countries like America of a similar sophistication of weapon system and in similar pricing and all those things, there must be reasons why we have chosen S-400 in the first place. Maybe I do not really know the technicalities of that. So even before we agreed on this delivery thing, you could see that a lot of US congressmen and women were flying to New Delhi in order to engage with the Indian policy making circle to sort of like give this idea that, okay, we are supporting this waiver, we are supporting this exception for India on the basis of India's calculation of national security and other things. But it really depends on circumstances again, because before Russia actually went ahead and invade Ukraine, right? I still remember talking to former American diplomats, and they told me that if the Ukraine crisis becomes more volatile, for more violent, right? It was going to become difficult for India to justify, for example, or those supporting this waiver in the US to justify this waiver. So I think it really, the future really depends on circumstances, that whether, if in the future, let's say America really comes around and says that, well, we have given you waiver, we cannot do it anymore because circumstances have changed and we need to put sanctions, right? In that case, it's a question about uh, what India is going to take. I don't think because just because Americans put sanctions, India is going to tell, from now on, okay, we are not buying Russian military hardware or anything like that. That's not going to happen. So um, we, as I said, we know the immediate condition, which is the waiver, and we know the near future, which is the period of the waiver. We are not very certain about like what kind of circumstances would allow that waiver to carry on, or what kind of circumstances would make it difficult for the US to carry on with that waiver and finally say that, well, you have to deal with this. We can't support this waiver anymore. So we have to wait and watch. What's going to be what's going to be really the implications of CAATSA on India. Right?
Yeah. Next question.
Thank you, sir. So there is another question in the chat box. It's from Gargi Priyadarshini. She's having some problem with the mic. Her question goes, what do you think are the possible scenarios of the changing geopolitics of South Asia and its implications for India?
Okay. Well, when we say changing geopolitics of South Asia and implications for India, I'll try to sort of answer it through India-US relationship in some sense or the other. Now, the biggest or the most consequential geopolitical happening or event or scenario in South Asia certainly has been the one in Afghanistan, right? In terms of a security implications, in terms of practically saying that what happens in Afghanistan is not going to stay in Afghanistan, and all the the worst scenarios that we were talking of when Taliban comes to power, the somewhat in the middle kind of scenarios that, well, Taliban is going to come to power, but because this is a new Taliban, it's going to behave in a different way. And those who said that no, it's the same Taliban, they're going to be as regressive as before, and they're not going to change, and it will have serious security implications for South Asia in terms of let's say support to terrorism and inspiration and all those things. And on the other hand, you had the other picture, which is a Taliban trying to get recognition internationally, a Taliban sort of trying to engage with the outside world in some way or the other. So this was the main event, the Afghanistan withdrawal, the takeover of Afghanistan by Taliban. But then now you have the other scenarios, right? Equally significant scenarios. One, of course, is the change of political atmosphere in Pakistan itself, right? The change of leadership and all the chaos that comes along with that kind of a change, and all the question marks that comes over, again, the future of civil-military relationship in Pakistan, and how that is going to impact, Pakistan's approach to India and vice versa, and also how that is going to impact US role in South Asia in the near future. And then you have the economic crisis playing out in Sri Lanka, for instance, right? So there are crisis points after crisis points in South Asia, and Afghanistan no longer remains the only sort of like geopolitical event of consequence in South Asia. You have a change of like a new kind of political change in Pakistan. You have an economic crisis staring at the face of Sri Lanka, right? So, and then you have the ever evident China's entry into South Asia in some sort of other. Whatever you are seeing in Sri Lanka certainly has a China factor. What you are going to see in Pakistan in the days to come will have a China factor, and what we are seeing in Afghanistan since the time of the takeover and even before that has also had a China factor. In Nepal, you have a China factor. In Bhutan, you have a China factor. So in the midst of all of this, it's going to be really, really important for India and the United States and this relationship to really sort of like think about, what is the future of India-US relations in South Asia going to be? Like, for instance, what kind of economic inputs or what kind of economic resources these two countries can give in terms of really forming a infrastructure alternative to the ones which are provided by China. I think in the 2+2 dialogue, they are also going to talk about a economic framework of the Indo-Pacific, which is sort of related to infrastructure financing and development of infrastructure across the Indo-Pacific. I think it's very important in South Asia that India and US finds a partnership in order to provide alternatives to the ones that China is providing, and also to jointly make sense of what has transpired in Afghanistan, what is transpiring in Pakistan, and the economic problems which are cropping up in Sri Lanka, and to really think through in terms of what, how does India-US partnership sort of like cover all of this, and then put it as a serious agenda and how we work together, right? So maybe I hope I answered some of your questions.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. Yes, any other question? Come on. Don't detain our guest for long. He may be having some other commitments.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
So my question is first of all, thank you for such an insightful session. My question is we are saying that we are having so many quads with US in the current times, but at the same time we also say that there are no security pacts that is happening in India, for example AUKUS. So can we say that in the nearer future some security pacts are required, those that would make those will make more difference to this relation between India and US?
Okay, thank you, Myra. That's a very interesting question, and I'm afraid that it's also a question that does not have a single answer, right? On the one hand, of course, there are a lot of people in both the sides, in India and also in the United States, who say that it is time that India and United States actually enter into some kind of formal alliance. Here, you have to understand that India is a different character in the Quad, because if you look at the other members of the Quad, it is Australia, Japan, and the US. Australia is an alliance partner of America, right? And Japan is also a military alliance partner of the US. India is the only country in the quadrilateral group which does not believe in entering into strict military alliances with any country. We think so because we believe that entering into strict military alliances with other countries would constrain India's autonomy of decision making, what we also refer often to as the practice of India's strategic autonomy. So there are those who believe that a stronger, a more strict security pact that has some, purpose will be better for this relationship. There are many others who believe that India should stay away from a strict military alliance with the US. India should go on its path of strategic autonomy. And many who are looking at the Ukraine crisis are actually now saying that India's autonomy of not really playing along with the US has again paid off in terms of the kind of neutral, the kind of independent decision making that we are doing as far as our interest is concerned regarding the Ukraine crisis. We believe that if we enter into any strict alliances, whether with the US or any other country, we will face certain limitations in our decision making. We might have to take certain decisions which we might not want to if we enter into strict alliances. You mentioned also AUKUS. Now, AUKUS is UK, Australia, and the United States. Now, we have to understand that, well, there might be some differences that crop up between the French and the Australians about the supply of nuclear submarines and other things. Let me also put it across to say that it is actually a case of supply of nuclear propulsion technology. It is not similar to proliferation, okay, according to the NPT. So that's a technical consideration you have to give. What I'm trying to say is that AUKUS again is an understanding between military allies. Australia is a military ally of the US, and UK is also an ally of the US. So it is something whereby three alliance partners are moving ahead with something which has nothing to do with India, for instance, right? So there was no way India could be a part of AUKUS because it is a very different kind of agreement between three alliance partners with a focus on China, with a focus on rattling the Chinese to some extent. So I think, as I said, I am sorry to say that your question might not have just one answer, because there are different viewpoints towards this. There are those who feel that India is better off not having any strict military alliances with any country. There are those also on the other end of the spectrum who believe that without a strict military alliance, without a formal structure, the Quad will not have much of a purpose and will not really know what to do. But there are others who believe that the strength of Quad is in the fact that it is not a military alliance. It covers a lot of things which are non-military in nature. So that is India's approach to the Quad. So, so what I'm trying to say is that there are different viewpoints, there are different ways of looking at it. And given the way India is going, I do not think that in the near future, we are going to enter into any kind of military alliance or strict alliance with the Americans or any other country.
Thank you, sir, for your response. Thank you so much.
Good evening, sir. Sir, Shreya this side. Sir, I would like to know your opinion on India's approach towards other Asian countries, as well as to see India as a global power. Is it possible to see India as a global power in near future?
Okay, Shreya, that's a difficult question to answer because we don't know, right, exactly what is going to happen. But we can only make a studied assessment based on what India really wants to become in the first place. I think India wants to become a country whose voices on important issues, global issues, are listened to and heard at the global table, right? India wants to become a country whose voices and whose contribution matters in the formation of regional peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. India, I think, thus has never really aspired or has not shown intentions or aspirations of becoming a global power whose character is to be synonymous to an aggressive power. That's not, I think, that's how we sort of make our character distinct in the international system. So I don't know for sure what should we answer this question about whether or not India can become a great power or a global power. I think India is already a global power if you consider in terms of whether India's voices are heard at the global table or listened to at the global table. If you are talking of global power in terms of having an aggressive military power trajectory or a country which tries to interfere with the economic practices of other countries, uh, then I don't think India is going in that direction. So it really depends on how we define global power. What is a global power in the first place? Is a global power necessarily an aggressive military power? Is a global power necessarily an economic power that practices unfair economic means to serve its interests? Then I don't think India wants to be or would aspire to be that kind of a global power. If a global power is one whose voice is important in maintaining peace and stability in the region and having global peace and stability, like uh, in crisis points across the world, I think India is already a global power in that sense. So I think it really depends on how we define global power and what kind of a global power India aspires to be and wants to be, right? So it really depends on that, how we define. If you define global power by the way how China behaves, I don't think India wants to be that kind of a global power, right? So first we have to think for ourselves what kind of a global power we aspire to be and what actually is a global power. So if depending on that definition, I think we can come to the conclusion whether India is already a global power or will be a global power in the near future.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Monish, there is a question for you in the chat box.
Yes, sir.
Can you read it or can I ask the Akriti to do it?
Concerns and challenges. All right. I think this is a question from
Akhilesh.
Akhilesh, yeah. Akhilesh's questions, I think, are pretty similar to what Myra had just asked, which is what kind of constraints India faces in terms of rising as a global player, right? Now, Akhilesh, this answer can be given in two ways. One is what kind of external challenges are we facing? That is one, right? So in terms of external challenges, you might say that, well, our complicated relationship with China, and China's approach to India's rise, that China doesn't really want India to emerge as a regional or global player of consequence. I think that, in that way, you can see external challenges in terms of the structure, in terms of the fact that there are countries around the world or countries which interests are not aligned with India. On the other hand, you might say that challenges also come from within, which in this case is how to continue growing our economy in a sustainable fashion that can support and that can prop up India's aspirations. In Hindi, right, we have a saying, कि पैर उतना फैलाना चाहिए जितना चादर है, right? So we need to increase that chadar, if we want to extend our feet in some sense or the other, right? So I'm saying that when we think of grand strategy, when we think of where India wants to be in the next 10 or 20 years or 25 years, we need to think about what are our inherent capabilities, both in material terms and in ideational terms, right? Ideational means our values of democracy and our values of projecting ourselves as a country that insists on peace and stability. And in terms of capabilities, our economic capabilities, how well we grow and how sustainable is the growth, and to what extent we are able to make ourselves self-reliant, right? The whole vision of Atmanirbhar Bharat and all those things. So I think the challenges are twofold. One is the challenges that come from without, from the external forces. And one is the challenges that come from within, which is that how we're able to increase our capability, how we are able to grow our multifaceted capability in a way where it supports our external vision, where it supports our external drive to become a global player of some consequence, which we already are, I think, of consequence. But if we are talking in terms of constraints and challenges, I think we have to see in that way, both external as well as internal challenges. Myra, raise your hand. You have a question?
Yes, sir. One question I wanted to ask. Like, there was a recent report by IMF which said that India has eradicated extreme poverty, which was quite recent. And I read another article in which American scholars said that India is a first world nation with third world problems. So, like, these were quite, like, these two incidents happened quite recently. Like, how can we, interlink these things? Like, we know the ground reality, like, there is still poverty in our country. So, what can we make of it? I'm just wondering on that thing.
No, I did come across that second statement where I think it was some book with I forgot the people who were associated with the book, but I did come across that report where I think in a book someone has made those comments that India is like what is the point you said? First world country.
It said that India is a first world nation with third world problems, third nation problem.
All right. So see, the question. I mean, these are perceptions in the first place. These are perspectives, right? As you said, there are ground realities which cannot be ignored and which the country should work towards, right? Which is again the idea of like completely eradicating poverty, or what is extreme poverty as compared to poverty, or how do we see, for example, the rise of the Indian economy and its implications for people on the ground, their ability to, for example, improve their standards of living and all those things. I think these are very complicated questions. These are whatever I think comments that came in terms of like first world country with third world problems, like first of all, I think it's very complicated to really sort of define in this era of globalization and the constraints that globalization is facing, to really define like what is really a first world country. What do you call a first world country? What are the metrics of measuring the indices, for example, of a first world country? Are all the European countries first world countries? What about other Asian countries? Like, what about poverty even in America, for instance? So I think it's a very relative answer, a very relative thing to say that whether a country is a first world country and what are third world problems in the first place, right? Are third world problems not existing, for example, in some countries of Europe or even in the United States? What are exactly these third world problems that they talk about, right? So I think that one should always take these perspectives and perceptions with a pinch of salt, and also not go entirely by one-liners that try to describe a country. India is a very complicated country to be described in one-liners like that, right? So I believe that the question really is about what are the internal contradictions, what are the internal challenges that we have to face and it's always going to be relative. It's never going to be like like कोई जादू की छड़ी होगा that in 1 or 2 years we're going to like completely change the face of the country. So a big country, a complicated country in a democratic country like India, as I said earlier, will take its time to go through certain processes in order to face challenges. I think the same is with the United States. The same is with many democracies around the world. So I think those kind of one-liners should be taken with a pinch of salt in terms of describing a very complicated country like India.
So any other question? Any other question? Or should I take it that
I
is
have
the
a
last
question. I have one more question.
But not after that.
Okay, sir. So I would just like to know your views upon the, if like on JCPOA.
Okay. All right. Again, not. Let me point out to the students that Akriti's question is not specifically related to India
Yes,
and
sir.
US.
Yes, sir.
So it is about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is the nuclear deal that was agreed upon between specifically the Obama administration and negotiated with 4 other veto-wielding members of the UNSC plus Germany. That's why the deal is called P5+1 with Iran, right? So this deal was agreed to between Iran and the P5+1 during Obama administration. But as we very well know, with the Trump administration coming in, this was revoked and abrogated. And during those times, there were also political changes within Iran, which also uses this kind of, let's say, setbacks in order to influence the hardliners versus the liberal voices within Iran itself, and impacts how Iran negotiates with US and other partners of the US. So this was in the limbo for quite some time during the Trump administration. But because this was an Obama era deal where Joe Biden was the vice president of Barack Obama, it was already being discussed when Joe Biden came to the presidency that somehow maybe he was going to try to bring it back, like he brought back the climate deal, the Paris Pact, from where Trump administration again had walked out. The way things stand now, Akriti, it's a little bit uncertain how things are going to go ahead. With the Ukraine problem, there's another problem, right? Because as the Russia-US relationship goes downhill and more differences crop up, I think one of the demands, if I'm not wrong, one of the demands that the Russian has additionally put during this time is that if the deal is struck and things happen, that the sanctions that are going to that are already in place against Russia, to what extent that would impact Russia's relations or transactions with Iran. That is one of the sticking points that has started to come up because of the Ukraine crisis. So there is already a problem right now in the JCPOA deal. It's not like it was not without problems, because problems were already there in terms of the degree of enrichment issue, that to what extent you need to enrich so that you reach the threshold whereby a civilian program becomes a nuclear program. There has been a lot of disagreements on that because the Iranians are giving a different picture. The Western countries are giving a different picture. The IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, is also playing a role in this. So I'm not certain for sure that how in the midst of all this, remember that JCPOA negotiation started, and all of a sudden you had the Ukraine crisis. So you already have a additional threat in the P5+1 already, because Russia is one of them, China is one of them, right? So as long as this Ukraine problem continues, and if the US-Russia relationship goes further down the hill, the Russians are going to put some demands that the Americans are not going to like. The Americans are going to put some kind of sanctions. If that impacts Russia and Iran transactions, the Russians are going to make it difficult for this deal to walk through. The Iranians also have their own internal political, let's say, dynamics, which is playing out. So on the one hand, you have the uncertainty about the enrichment issue, the extent of enrichment and degree and difference of opinion on that. On the other hand, you have political dynamics both between inside the US as well as Iran. Now, remember that in November, US is going to go for midterm elections, and the Congress in the US, if it becomes Republican dominated, the Republicans are not in favor of this kind of deal. Okay, So that will be another factor which might pull down the deal, right? Then you also have, as I said, the Ukraine crisis and the Russia-US relationship problem. So this deal, which had some ray of hope in the beginning when the Biden administration came, as November elections come in the US, in Congress, US-Russia relationship goes for a sixer, and continued differences over the enrichment issue. So there are a lot of uncertainties in JCPOA. So I don't know for sure what is really going to be the near future of this deal and what is going to be the impact of that on the larger, issue of non-proliferation, especially in the Middle East and North African area.
Thank you,
So
sir.
with that, we come to the close of this question answer session, because if I don't stop the students, they will go on putting questions to you, and they will return. I know you are have other commitments also. So with that, we come to the end of this question answer session. And if there are any questions, you can email to the guest. They can reply at ease. And once again, I will take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Monish, for sparing time and giving very valuable insight into the US relations. And I think students will definitely be benefited by your observations, and it will help them in understanding the true nature of India-US relations. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And